Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to demonstrate another idea for a special ability that you can give to characters and or enemies in combat that might make combat a little more interesting. And that ability I've called paralyze. So if we look at the hover text for the various enemies and for the player characters, you'll see that I've given them all the skill paralyze, which isn't, of course, a situation that would be very likely in real life. It would probably, in a real game, you would probably limit it to perhaps assassins that have sort of poison daggers or something, perhaps creatures like spiders that have sort of venom, something like that. And maybe in terms of player characters, maybe sort of assassins would be able to use it or something like that. In tabletop role-playing, I know in D&D, some undead have the ability to paralyze their enemies. But anyway, I've just given it to all of the characters because that makes it more likely to come up and it makes it easier to demonstrate. So let's have a look at what it does. So as you can see, we have the initiative, and okay, so I've hit the enemy and they are paralyzed, and there's a new graphic which is has a P over it to indicate that they're paralyzed. Okay, so the last character hit enemy 2 and paralyzed them. Then it was the enemy's go, and the way paralyzation works is that when it's your turn to attack, and if you're paralyzed, you don't get an attack, and this is true for both monsters and player characters. You don't get an attack, you get to roll to see if you throw off the paralyzation. And in this case, enemy 1 stayed paralyzed, but enemy 2 ceased to be paralyzed. So that's why it says that enemy 2 is paralyzed, but we never got to see the P graphic because they immediately threw it off. But because they've done that, that's their turn. So if we click this, we'll see now that enemy 3 attacks rather than enemy 2. We can see that enemy 3 hits but doesn't paralyze the character that he hit. The way that I've set it up is, as usual, I've set up the sort of very simple version of this power, probably more simple than you would have in your own game, where if you get hit, you have a 50% chance of being paralyzed. And similarly, if you are trying to throw off the paralyzation, you have a 50% chance of doing that. You'd probably have some other factor. You might have constitution. If you have a constitution ability, that might, or stamina or something like that, that might affect it. You might have particular races more likely to throw it off, like dwarves. You might say that they're hardier or something and they're more likely to throw it off. But as usual, I've just done the simplest possible version. And so the combat goes on. I won't go through the whole one, but we can see there that one of our characters was paralyzed as well. But let's get out of that and have a look at the code. And this is one of these cases where it's quite an easy thing to describe. It's sort of intuitive and it feels like it should be fairly simple, but actually it requires changing almost every page. If you're familiar, if you've been following this series and you have seen the pages, you might notice there's a couple of extra ones. There's paralyze and paralyzation. Paralyze is where it tests to see if a hit has paralyzed someone. So this is sort of the attack, and then paralyzation is sort of the defense one. It's where a character rolls to see if they throw off paralyzation. But as well as those two new pages, there's sort of changes required to almost every page. So I may not show you every bit of code because the principle is basically the same for each one. It's if you're paralyzed, you don't get a go. You don't get an attack, but you do get a chance to try and throw it off. And also in terms of victory or defeat, uh, being paralysed counts as being defeated. In other words, if you had, if the, if those 4-player characters, if 2 of them were dead and 2 of them were paralysed, that would count as losing the battle. That would be the end of the game, because of course, if everyone's paralysed, they can't fight back, and the monsters can sort of do what they will to you. And similarly, if they had killed 2 of the orcs and paralysed 4 of them, that would count as victory for them as well. So let's have a look. We'll just sort of go around all the pages, or at least most of them. I will say as a side note, up to now I had $C and $E being the number of player characters and the number of enemy characters respectively. And that's not a very, what's the word? It was a little bit of a wasteful way of doing it. It required some fairly complex code, whereas I could have an array, and slot 0 of the array is the number of player characters and slot 1 is the number of enemies, and that cuts down on a lot of that code. So I have done that, and that is the array NO. So if you see the array, or $NO, so if you see that array as we go through the code, that just was what used to be $E or $C, i.e. it's the number of player characters or the number of enemies. Often used when we need to check every member of a particular side, usually in the form of a for loop. We go from 1 to, formerly we'd go to $C or $E. Now we just go to the relevant slot of $NO. But the main change here is that we have this new array called $PA, which of course stands for paralyze or paralysation, and it is initially set to 0 for every character. There's a slot for every character, and if that character becomes paralysed, then their slot of the PA array is set to 1. Obviously, we need to add the word paralysed to the list of skills, and also I've changed when we are assigning the skills, I've just given everyone paralyze. Which again is not, that probably wouldn't happen in a real game. It's just that makes it easier to demonstrate. So here's an example of instead of using in this case E, we use $NO1, which is a little bit bulkier. It's a few extra characters, but there's other places where we save quite a lot on code. So I sort of decided that overall it was worth it. But $PA is the main change. The addition of this $PA array is the main change that we've made on this particular page. Okay, so on display, the main difference is before we were displaying pictures of the enemies, and if they were dead, we had a different picture that indicated that they were dead. But now we have a third option, which is that they're not dead, but they are paralysed. And so we need to add that possibility when we're displaying both sides. So here we're displaying the enemies, and we're not directly printing these commands. We're putting them all in the W array, and then printing W right at the end, because when you have printing stuff and then you have ifs and else ifs in the middle, sometimes you can get errors where, like if you have a div before and a slash div after the if, it can have trouble matching them up and stuff. So that's why I've done it like that. But anyway, so this code we had before, if $H, which is the hit points, if this enemy's current hit points is less than 1, well, that means they're dead. So add to W this image, which is orcd.png, which of course is the one that indicates that they're dead. You may have noticed that I changed the graphics for, actually I'm not sure that came up. I have changed the pictures that indicate when a character's dead as well, but that's not wasn't particularly difficult or important. I just um, took the opportunity to do it. So we already know that, but if the character's not dead, normally what we do, if the character's not dead, is we do one variant of printing orc.png, which is the alive one, but we need to put this code in here to account for the possibility that they're paralysed, which is, so we say else if $PA square bracket 1 n square bracket $z n square bracket equals 1. Then we add this orc p image. So that's the array that's to do with being paralysed. 1 means the enemy side. $Z is just the number of the enemy. So if the enemy that we're looking at is if the value of their slot in the $PA array is equal to 1, that's what that equals means, then they're paralysed, and therefore we will want to be displaying orc p. And similarly, down here when we're displaying the player character, if their hit points are less than 1, then we're going to be printing the image PCZ, so PC2D.png, for example. So we have PC1.png, PC2.png, PC3 and PC4.png. They're the pictures of the characters alive, and then we have PC1D, PC2D, etc. for them dead. And then, of course, we have, if the relevant slot in the PA array, and this time it's 0 because we're talking about player characters, is equal to 1, then they're paralysed, and we print, for example, PC3p.png, which is the one which is the picture of player character 3, but with the sort of darker, and it's got the P sign on it to indicate that they're paralysed. So that's the main difference in the display page. So this is the enemy page where the enemy chooses who to attack, or of course the computer program chooses it for them. But and here's an example of when we're using the $NO array instead of, in this case, C, for example. So because the enemies are only going to target, they were only targeting living PCs, but now they're only targeting living non-paralysed PCs, we have to change this bit of code. It used to be that if the hit points were over 0, which is what H0Z is, then we will set their slot in T to be 1, which means that T is the array that deals with whether a given enemy is a valid target. Well, this time now it has to say if H0Z is over 0 and $PA0Z is equal to 0. In other words, if they're alive and not paralysed, then they're a valid target. And similarly, we have to do this for all the different strategies. You might remember that there's an array CS, $CS, for the enemies, which determines their strategy for choosing targets. Of course, we don't need one of those for the player characters because the player chooses the target. But the main strategy is just to choose randomly. But then there's also another strategy which is to choose whoever's got the lowest armor class, and there's another strategy which is to choose whoever's got the lowest hit points. And in all of those cases, whenever we say, well, if the hit points is over 0, then do something, consider them a valid target. Well, now it has to say if the hit points are over 0 and they're not paralysed, consider them a valid target. So that's why we've got that there and there, and that's why we've got it there and there for the third strategy. All right. So the main difference in terms of strike is quite simple because I've put the code for deciding whether someone gets paralysed in its own page because it was a bit easier. So we go to the part of the code that deals with when somebody hits, and specifically when they hit them and don't kill them. So we have this possibility, which is if H $DE is the defending side and $Z is the number of the target. If the hit points of the target are less than 1, then we're going to do this, which is just a message that says that you've killed them. But otherwise, and we put in this new bit of code here, which is if $SK, remembering that $SK is the array that deals with skills. If $SK square bracket $AT n square bracket $CA n square bracket 4 n square bracket is equal to 1, then we need to include this new page called paralyze. So $SK is a fairly complicated three-dimensional array. The first variable there is which side is attacking. The second variable is $CA, which is the current attacker. And the third variable, number 4, is because paralyze is skill number 4. So all this is saying is if the current attacker has skill 4, and we see that by looking in the SK array, then we need to include this page paralyze. And paralyze is the page which decides whether the target gets paralyzed. And it's fairly straightforward. If random bracket 0, 1 end bracket is equal to 1, and they're not currently paralyzed. Now, that is redundant because they shouldn't be attacking a paralyzed target anyway, but I just put that in there just in case you might decide to change it, or I might decide to change it so that they can attack paralyzed enemies. You might even decide that attacking a paralyzed enemy is a lot easier, that you're more likely to hit, or even that you hit automatically, and perhaps even that you do extra damage, because of course killing someone who's on the ground sort of frozen is going to be easier than trying to kill someone who is actively trying to kill you and defend against being killed. But as the game stands at the moment, this particular bit of code is redundant because there should never be a case where the target is paralyzed. So PA, $DE, $Z always should be 0. Should be 0 if you get to this page anyway. But anyway, so if random 0, 1 equals 1, that's the decision. That's the way that we're making this roll now. It's just a 50% chance. As I said before, you'd probably have other factors at play to make it more likely. You probably wouldn't have a simple if like this. You'd probably have a fair bit of code to decide whether they were paralyzed. But anyway, if they are paralyzed, then we set the defender's slot in the $PA array to 1 to indicate that they're paralyzed, and then we update the message that we're going to display. If $AT is equal to 0, which means if the player characters are attacking, then they'll get the message enemy 4 is paralyzed, or whatever it may be. And if it is the enemies, monsters attacking the player characters, then we use this array $N, which is the names of the player characters. So it'll say Black Leaf is paralyzed, or whoever it is. All right, so that's what paralyze does. Victory check. This is where we check if someone's victorious. The change that we have to make here is we're looking to see if any defender is alive and not paralyzed, whereas before we were only checking to see if they were alive. So this is another example of if the hit points are over 0. Well, that's how it was. It was just this bit before, and now it has to be if the hit points are over 0 and they're not paralyzed. Well, that indicates that there's a defender up and fighting. And if not, well, either we get the message you have been wiped out, or we get the message that you've beaten your foes. Because if there's only paralyzed opponents, well, that's not going to be much of a challenge. You can consider that you've won. All right, So now we have next actor. I changed the name of this because it used to be called next attacker, but we might find that the next actor is a character that has paralyzation. So this is where we get into sorry, not that has paralyzation in the sense that has the skill, but is themselves paralyzed. So this is where we get into rolling to see if a character throws off the paralyzation. So what we're doing here is we're finding the next, whose move is next. And the way we do that is we have $CA, which originally stood for current attacker. Maybe you would say it stands for current actor now, but either way. We add one to it, and then by default, that's who gets to act next, but there's various special conditions. So if the hit points of that character is less than 1, well, they're dead. Well, that's no good. We include next actor, i.e. we go back to the top of the page. Otherwise, and here's the new, here's some new code. If that character is paralyzed, well, then we're going to include paralyzation, and then we're going to include next actor, because this character won't get an attack either. So what will happen here, in the case of them being paralyzed, is they'll get to go to this page where they roll to see if they come out of the paralyzation, and then once we've done that, we move on to the next player character or the next enemy. So paralyzation is fairly straightforward. We're going to add to the message, which is $M. We're going to either give them the message, and again it's just a 50% chance in this version, and again in your game you may want to have more complexity, more factors at play. But in this case it's just random bracket 0, 1. If that equals 1, then the character throws off their paralyzation, which means we set the relevant slot in PA to be 0, and we have the message enemy 3 or whatever it may be, or the name of the person throws off their paralyzation. Otherwise, they haven't done it, and we give the message remains paralyzed. Of course, you could, you might decide that it's not worth giving them a message just to say this person's still paralyzed, but I decided to have that partly just so I could make sure that it was going to the page and was giving them a chance to come out of it. So that's fairly straightforward. The only other thing I need to show you, actually, there's two more things. So when we're finding the first attacker, you may remember this is a matter of this is something that gets accessed when we've changed sides, when everyone on one side has had a go. We need to find who's going to get to strike at the enemy first. And paralyzed characters aren't going to get to strike first because they don't get a strike, but they should get this. They should get something else. They should have the opportunity to come out of their paralyzation. So what we do is we set $CA to 0. Then we include this page where we increment it by 1. We add 1 to it. If the hit points of the relevant character is less than 1, well, that character's dead, so that's no good. So we need to include this page again. In other words, basically go back to the top of the page. And here's the new code. Otherwise, if this character is paralyzed, then we include paralyzation, which is the page we saw before. And once we've done that, then we need to include first too. We go back to the top of the page because that character's paralyzed, they're not going to be the first attacker. Now, there's one more thing I need to show you, and this is an example of how different skills can interact, and how you need, when you're adding a skill, you need to think about how they're going to interact. So there is a skill called smoke bombs, and the way it works is that if you, the player, decides that the player characters will run away, and if you have a character who's alive and has the smoke bombs skill, then you get to run away without having to suffer another round of attacks from the enemies. Normally, when you decide to flee, you forego your attacks. They get to attack you, and they actually get a bonus to hit you. It's more likely that their blows will hit in this particular round. But if any character has smoke bombs, then they throw down a smoke bomb, and you flee the fight, and sort of for free, as it were, without that extra danger. And on this page, we go here when the character has decided to flee, and we need to see if any character has the skill of having smoke bombs. So we go for y equals 1, y is under or equal to $0, which is the number of player characters. If the hit points of that character are greater than 0, because of course if they're dead they're not going to be throwing down a smoke bomb, and if $SK0Y2 is equal to 1, in other words, if they have the skill smoke bombs, then we set this variable z to be equal to the number of the character, and that indicates that yes, there's someone who's alive and has smoke bombs, and therefore the characters are going to get away. But if they're paralyzed, of course, they're not going to be throwing any smoke bombs either. So we need to add this code, which is if $PA0Y4, that's not right, is it? I've just realised that's wrong. Sorry, I'm not going to do the whole video again. It should be this. I got overexcited by the I got confused by the fact that SK is 3-dimensional. Sorry, it should be 2-dimensional. It should be like that. If PA0Y, I'll correct it in the zip version that I upload to itch.io, so it'll be right there. All right, so sorry about that. We need to add this. If PA0Y is equal to 0, in other words, if player character number Y is not paralyzed, then we set Z equals Y. Sorry about that. I didn't notice that until just then. Yeah, PA is of course a 2-dimensional array. One being the side that they're on, 0 or 1, and 1 being the number of the player characters. I got confused with the skill paralyze, which of course is different to the condition of being paralyzed or not paralyzed. So we need to add that. If $PA0Y is equal to 0, then do this code. Now, the other thing you would need to do, and I haven't done this because once the combat ends, the game is in. It's not part of a larger game. But if it were part of a larger game, of course, you would have to program that if the player characters flee, then any of the characters that are paralyzed are lost, because you're not going to take those characters with you. You could have some sort of mechanism where maybe one of them can sort of drag a paralyzed character away or something. But if they're running away in terror from a combat, I'd say you'd probably, obviously it's up to you, but you'd probably rule that they can't carry characters with them, and that anyone who's paralyzed is left behind and sort of is out of the game. But of course I haven't done that because there is no after the combat. This is just a demonstration of combat. All right. So, and that interaction there where smoke bombs won't work if you're paralyzed is an example of how different special abilities, you've got to sort of think about how they're going to interact with all the other special abilities before you program them. Because if you don't, you might end up with things happening that are, well, at worst you'll end up with an error, but you also might end up with things happening that are very counterintuitive, like characters that are hypnotized but can still cast spells or something like that. And unfortunately, of course, the more special abilities you have, the more special abilities you have to think about when you're adding a new one. All right, so that is paralysation. This is probably the end of this little mini series on having combat. The next stage of making combat more complicated would probably be having a map, because at the moment, of course, we just have they just line up and take turns hitting each other. And if we wanted to make combat sort of more complex, we might want to think about, well, can we have actual positions and flanking and stuff like that? And I want to, I will sort of explore that, but I want to explore that in the context of looking at a new genre of game, or not a new genre, but one that I haven't covered yet, which is roguelikes. And I'm going to be looking at that hopefully from the next video on. But I hope that you found what I did today useful or interesting, and I hope you will tune in next time. I'm sorry about the error that I did there, but it'll be fixed in the zip version on itch.io. So I hope you will tune in next time.